Hi, I'm Evan Hashemi.
And I'm Dylan Rosenthal, and today we're going to be talking about the influence of language and emotion. Oh. Alright, so our real life situation is a few years ago, Facebook performed a study on 700,000 of their users to try and influence their emotions by exposing them to different posts. Now, they used an algorithm to detect the language that was used for positively connotated words and negatively connotated words. And what they did was they exposed a portion of the users to more positively connotated, positively worded posts, and they produced results of posting more positive words themselves. And then the same thing happened when they exposed another group to negative worded posts, and they posted negative worded posts as well. And from this real life situation, we came to our knowledge question.
So, the knowledge question that we derived is, to what extent can language and emotion influence individual perspectives? Now, connecting that back to the real life situation, in a real life situation, we see how Facebook used language with different emotional connotations to slowly affect its users' perspective over time. Over a certain period of time, as each of the users was exposed to these different emotionally connotated words, they began to see things, they began to view these posts through these emotional lenses that eventually affected their own perspective as they began to post things with these same emotional lenses, that is, positive or negative, depending on the post that they got. These posts being shared are considered representations of the user's individual perspective because they are original thoughts and content expressed in a public setting. Now let's discuss some possible answers to this knowledge question as we continue the connection.
So one of the answers that we got to our knowledge question was the connotation of words determines the extent to which one's individual perspective can be affected. So there are many different emotions, and each emotion has a plethora of words that can be used to describe this emotion. And because of this, it can be very there are many different words to express these emotions, and because of this, there are a lot of interpretations that can be made of these words, and this varies from person to person, which makes the language in which the emotion is expressed to be subjective because it is seen on a person-to-person basis. Now, the person who is looking at this language can either have a great emotional interpretation of the word or have a small emotional interpretation of the word. And this in turn will affect how large of an influence the language has on their individual perspective based on the meaning of the word to them.
Another possible answer that we have derived is that emotion influences individual perspective to a much greater extent than that of language. Now the argument is that language is just a means of transporting the emotion, and that the actual connotated emotion is what had an effect on the individuals. The individuals had just seen words, random words they wouldn't have, and their perspective wouldn't have changed. But since these words had connotated emotions, it slowly affected them over time. They began to see things through emotional lens, and there was eventually a change or an influence on their perspective.
And a counter argument to this is that actually language has a larger influence on individual perspective than emotion, and this can be determined by since emotion is expressed, there are many different ways to express emotion, but the most clear way to do this is through language. And since language is an easier way to express this, it's also easier to understand by other people, and therefore can have a greater impact on their individual perspective because it is easier to understand. And without language, it would be a lot more difficult to get one's emotions across and understood by others. So language makes it more clear and is a vessel to spread emotion. Another possible answer to our knowledge question is the amount of faith that the individual has in the source of the language and emotion. Now, to go back to our real life situation, the posts that were exposed to the users were selected based off of their friends and what their friends are sharing. They were just presented in a different way. And So these people were friends with friends of the people that posted the information that was available to them, and therefore they had relationships, and there was some trace of trust or faith in each other, and this would have an impact on the emotional connotation of the words because they'd have knew them on a personal level, and this could have a greater impact on their individual perspective.
And another derived answer is that individual perspective is affected to the extent of time that people are exposed to different language and emotion. So back to the real life situation, the users were not presented with a negatively or positively connotated word and then instantly there was a change in their perspective or a noticeable change or observed change in their perspective. They were over periods of time exposed to multiple different types of emotionally connotated language that slowly changed their perspective. And Facebook slowly observed changes in their posts. It didn't happen right away. Now, a counter argument to this claim is that if someone were to be constantly exposed to a certain emotionally connotated word or certain language and emotion for extended periods of time, they could experience a desensitization, and the effect would lose its effect as one would not become as their perspective would not change because the word would have lost its meaning, would have lost its emotional connotation. Now, all of these answers fall under believing that language and emotion do in fact have an influence on perspective at all. Let's talk about an example where they don't.
So as Evan said, there is a chance that language and emotion have no effect on perspective. And this example is very extreme, but in the case of sociopaths, these are people who do not have the abilities to detect emotion and they lack emotion. Therefore, the emotion that's presented to them does not have an effect on them. And therefore, the language that is presented to them that has an emotional connotation would not have an impact on their individual perspective.
So now let's discuss other real-life situations in different areas of knowledge that also relate to this knowledge question. Take it away.
So first, we're going to relate it to the arts. And in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, there is a language of Newspeak, which is a language that the vocabulary of it decreases each year. And it is a very simplified version of English, and it's actually being cut down in order to limit the public and their opinions and their actual individual perspective. And in order to do this, they are removing words that can be seen as bad or negatively connotated. And they are also taking away concepts that could oppose the government in power, which is known as the party. And in order to do this, they're taking away concepts such as freedom and anything that could have any sort of opposition to the party. And one of the quotes is, "The whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. There will be no thought and not needing to think." Therefore, the whole point of Newspeak is to use this language to make sure that people cannot have their own individual perspective. And this is because the government wants total and complete control of the people living in their society. Another part of 1984 is the role of emotion, and there is an issue in the society because no one is allowed to speak out or express themselves, for example, through emotion, because individuality is frowned upon because the government is going for conformity because they want everyone to be the same and follow the government and not have their own ideas. And an example of the threat of having individual emotion can be seen is during a portion of the book when a prole, which is a lower class citizen, is expressing anger and is immediately taken out by the police.
All right, and another example that we are going to look at is within the area of knowledge, history. It deals with the same ways of knowing of language and emotion, and it's we're talking about Martin Luther's 95 Theses. So, Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses as a sort of list of the things that the Catholic Church was doing wrong. And he uses language and emotion to present these things and to convince others of the Catholic Church's faults. Some examples are that he calls the use of, so one of the things that he focuses on are the indulgences that the Catholic Church allows people to pay to decrease their time in purgatory. So Martin Luther calls the use of purgatory as a horror of despair in order to coax people into paying indulgences. He also says that people who think indulgences will save them are eternally damned. Now, this use of harsh emotion in his language would help people sympathize with him, maybe come over to his view and change their perspective. Now, it is evident that these perspectives were indeed changed because the Protestant Reformation took place. Different sects of Christianity were created. Some people stopped revering the Catholic Church as this ultimate, holy, and undeniable thing. Different sects of Christianity were created, and thus perspectives were changed. Now let's talk about some final thoughts. So, language and in conclusion, language and emotion have a significant impact on a personal and individual perspective because of the ways they can determine and shape the way one thinks. In each of our real-life situations, like in the Facebook example, we see how different posts with negative or positive connotations affected how negative or positive one's perspective or the user's perspectives were. In Dylan's example of 1984, Newspeak affected how the perspective of the individuals in the state, because they weren't able to think freely, aren't able to have thoughts of opposition or negative thoughts about the government. And in my example, language and emotion affected people so vastly that a whole reformation took place.
And our results, these have real-life implications. For example, in Facebook's experiment, they claimed that they were doing this to help them further their research in developing an algorithm to detect if users on Facebook were becoming depressed or leading towards committing suicide. And another example of how this has real-life implications is larger corporations, due to the help of social media and how we're all constantly connected, can now use use the language that can have strong emotional connotations to convince people who are participating or looking at the information they present and change their individual perspective or manipulate them to act in a specific way. So in order to kind of combat this, we should become more aware of the implications that language can have or emotion can have in the way that we act and change our individual perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.